Big shock, I know. I think that is the first time I've said that. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Gita Marie and this is a video in the impact analysis series. So not very long ago I talked about the impact of leather and there has been many requests for a similar video. So let's dive into wool production, impact, sustainability claims, industry practice. I don't think I'm going out on a limb here if I claim that many consumers view wool as a sustainable, natural and ethical material. There is a lot of positive associations with wool as a material. Wool production also have a rich history full of traditions because we've been taking wool and turning it into fabric for thousands of years. These associations with tradition and sustainability and something being natural is an incredibly powerful tool, and it can often obscure real environmental and animal welfare concerns. Wool occupies a very privileged place in the fashion world because it's associated with pastoral imagery and biodegradability and tradition, and that helps brands present wool as a more natural alternative to synthetic materials and even to other natural materials like cotton. If you use or wear wool, you have probably seen this logo. This is from Woolmark, an organization representing 60,000 Australian wool farmers. They routinely call wool a friend of the environment, and that has really caught on. But does it actually hold up? In 2019, global wool production represented 1.1% of all fibers produced. From 2018 to 2019, the global total of sheep increased by 30 million. And this is the most sheep reported globally since the United Nations began documenting in the 60s. The top producers of wool globally are Australia, China, the United States and New Zealand. And the 5 major types of wool apparel that drive the market are women's overcoats, men's trousers, men's suits, men's jackets and men's overcoats. Globally, the wool industry is valued at $4.7 billion, while sheep meat is valued at $6.7 billion. If we start by looking at the broad perspective, painting with a very wide brush, approximately 16.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from animal agriculture. A majority of these emissions can be traced directly back to ruminant animals like grazing cows and sheep. Some of the aspects that really affect this impact is feed production as well as land conversion into grazing land. And because a large part of the emissions from animal agriculture come from specifically cattle and sheep, that also means that about half of the global greenhouse gas emissions are methane, significantly more potent than CO2. You often see brands and manufacturers in the global garment industry label wool products as biodegradable and sustainable and natural. You will also easily find a lot of claims about regenerative farming practices and regenerative wool. And I have a main problem with a lot of these terms because they are very loosely enforced and very vaguely defined. And as a result, when consumers seek out information about the production methods of their products, they're often misled to believe that something is more effective or has a more positive impact than what is actually the case. It's very difficult to find clear and meaningful information that adequately delivers on data and traceability. Now, from an environmental perspective, I agree that there is a massive difference between mass-produced, intensified industries and intensive animal agriculture and the small farm on the hill. Those two have different impacts because they produce at different scales and with different premises as their main priority. It's just, chances are that if you're buying something in a commercial store, you're not buying from the small farm on the hill. The small farm on the hill does exist, but the products that come from that kind of production is expensive, and rightfully so, and also produced in limited scale, so it's not as easily accessible. Low-key small-scale farming and limited stock is everything the garment industry hates. There's not really any solid or convincing evidence or data that suggests that wool production is climate friendly, whatever climate friendly even means. Sheep are grazing animals and they produce significant amounts of methane. Wool production requires raising and maintaining large numbers of sheep, and their carbon footprint per kilogram of fiber is often higher than that of cotton or synthetic materials. In addition, sheep farming requires extensive land use, which can lead to deforestation and soil degradation and biodiversity loss, which we are seeing in many areas that are heavily impacted by sheep farming. For instance, in Australia, where entire ecosystems have been impacted and destroyed due to the grazing. And fun fact, okay, well, it's not fun, but wool requires around 367 times more land than producing the same amount of cotton. I would like to address the claims of regenerative farming being a solution to a lot of these problems that we're seeing with any kind of animal agriculture. This is sort of my main take. Regenerative farming applies a lot of really reasonable and beneficial practices, but it's not a practice that can be adapted or applied to the existing industry one-to-one. Regenerative farming, compared to industrial animal agriculture, requires more land. You need a lot of space to move these massive amounts of animals around in order for the soil not to be completely destroyed. And having all this space available is incredibly good news for animal welfare. It's just, and this is one of the biggest dilemmas when it comes to environmental practices and production methods, right? When animal welfare go up because animals get more space, the carbon footprint goes up as well. In the existing industry, it is extremely difficult to lower the carbon footprint while maintaining the same amount of animals on more space. That's not happening, which means that while a lot of the regenerative farming practices are really beneficial and sustainable, they cannot really exist without a drastic reduction of volume in what we are producing. We have to produce less if we want to do it sustainably. Producing beyond planetary boundaries can, by definition, not be regenerative. Now let's have a look at the actual carbon footprint. Even though different processes produce different wool byproducts, they all carry the same high starting point. Most of the lower grade fibers still fall within the 25 to 30 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram range, but some materials are higher. Some wool products land around 50 kilograms, belly wool fibers around 70, and others again around 85 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram, which when we compare to other types of fibers, any kind of fiber really, is definitely in the high end. You can make these calculations in a lot of different ways, which means that you often see various results, but the pattern overall remains the same. Then there are also recycled options that fall just around the 30 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram. In simple terms, you could say that wool has a front-loaded carbon footprint, which means that while processing and dyeing and turning the wool into fabric adds emissions, the main part of wool's impact comes from the farming. So when we talk about real climate solutions here, numbers point to two things. Firstly, the only way to significantly reduce the total kilograms of CO2 is to cut emissions at the farm level. Things like improving sheep productivity, changing feed, better land management, and looking at regenerative farming practices are all good tools to get there. Obviously, having fewer sheep, producing less, is the best way to get there. But you rarely see any of the major reports talk about that. Neither the having less sheep part, but also not doing any of the other things really. And that could be because a lot of the major studies that are done on sheep farming and wool production are funded by wool manufacturers. What? Yeah, I know. Crazy. Strategies like using the garment for longer, recycling fibers, and choosing lower impact wool types don't erase those original emissions, but they can spread them out over more use, which lowers the impact per garment per wear. Most of the energy is used when the wool is processed into fabric, while the biggest share, the climate pollution, comes from the farming stage where the wool is produced. And according to this study, how we wash and care for the sweater also add to the total impact. And we have talked about how important it is as consumers to wear our clothing for as long as possible. So this should not be news. But this perspective is really where some of these reports show their true colors. Because these studies show again and again that wool production has a front-loaded carbon footprint and it comes from the farming practices. Yet the recommendations in these reports are mainly focusing on consumer use patterns. And I think it's important to talk about. It's one of my main points all the time is that we need to use less and use what we have for longer. Now, I really want to underline here that this doesn't mean that the data, the calculations are necessarily incorrect in the study, but it is something worth having in mind because it can impact how the research and how the findings are framed. Because we see again and again that commercial interests can frame how these findings are presented. When it comes to the initial farming impact, I think this article is worth having a look at as well. It uncovers how in parts of the UK, especially places like Dartmoor, there are too many sheep grazing the land, and this is stopping nature from recovering. Because the animals eat young trees and plants before they can grow, woodlands can't come back, wildlife struggles, and important habitats like peat bogs, which hold a lot of carbon, are destroyed. What makes this controversial is that public money is helping to support this system, so taxpayers are indirectly paying for farming practices that can make climate change and biodiversity loss worse. This is, above all else, a criticism of the subsidy system. Shouldn't public money be funding environmental recovery rather than destruction. And my last point within the environmental chapter of this video, but even though there are some properties and qualities in wool, like it can be long-lasting, biodegradable, and there's no way around that those properties exist, when we take that material and we pop it into the fast fashion industry, where the vast majority of wool is used, those qualities disappear. Take a material that could be long lasting and we use it to design products that are meant to fall apart. Then all of that doesn't matter anymore. And more frequently than not, we also see wool in blended mixes with other materials like cotton or synthetic fabrics, which means that it definitely no longer lives up to its biodegradable natural image. So yeah, no fabric is inherently sustainable if it's used in a business model that thrives on overconsumption. Big shock, I know. I think that is the first time I've said that. We're going to move away from the environmental perspective and talk a little bit about the ethical dilemmas and implications that are also within this industry. Sheep are animals and they're living beings used in a very intensive industry. I think we owe it to those living beings to be thoroughly knowledgeable on what happens in this industry. Because I see wool being marketed as ethical often. I see that this is something both brands are saying, and I think a lot of consumers are believing it. And I think one of the main reasons why that has been such an easy sell is because compared to leather or fur, you don't necessarily have to kill the sheep. But I feel like shearing rather than slaughtering is a really low bar for something being ethical. Although you think these sheep are gonna live out their full lives, girl. But I think it's possible that we as consumers tend to forget that. We are told that sheep naturally have wool, and if farmers do not help sheep remove its wool, it can become really uncomfortable and in some cases die. As such, farmers and sheep have this symbiotic relationship where farmers help the sheep and then they get to keep the wool that the sheep no longer need, and the sheep is happy to be rid of it. Well, there are serious animal welfare concerns embedded in modern wool production. Sheep are selectively bred to produce unnaturally large amounts of wool, making them deliberately dependent on regular shearing and vulnerable to heat and stress and disease. Common practices such as tail docking or mulesing cause pain and is often performed without anesthesia. While the industry often frames wool as a byproduct of sheep care, a lot of these practices reveal a routine that is designed to maximize profit. Many lambs are shorn just before their slaughter at the age of 9 months old. Depending on the market at the time, some sheep may be slaughtered with wool still attached, if skin with long wool on it is fashionable. Some types of sheep are kept older where they are regularly shorn if the quality of the wool keeps being at a certain level. If the quality of wool decreases, the animals are sent for slaughter, much like with dairy cattle. And this typically occurs when the sheep are between 5 and 6 years old. Meanwhile, the natural lifespan of sheep is around 12 years. And sheep aren't naturally dependent on humans to remove their wool. I think this is one of those things that a lot of consumers don't think about, choose not to, or is just misinformed about, just like why cows produce milk. In the case with sheep, we have taken specific species and we have selectively and intensively bred them to produce larger skin folds and thus more wool. We have created a type of animal that is completely dependent on human interference in order to thrive. And this can become really uncomfortable. This is especially true for sheep like merino sheep, but you see this in the industry overall. And the thing is, with these large folds of skin, they become prime targets for pests and bugs that can sort of lay eggs in between the folds of skin. A lot of these infestations like fly strike are prevented by mulesing. And if you want to look up pictures of it, that is on your own accord. It is absolutely horrendous. Without anesthesia, typically, to make sure that the bugs don't have a lot of stuff to latch onto. We selectively bred sheep to have all this skin, and then they became prime targets for pests and bugs, and then we mutilated them by removing the skin. Great! As I said in the beginning, there is obviously a massive difference between mass production and the small farm on the hill. In the vast majority of cases, we're leaning towards the intensified agriculture part, but perhaps you're wondering, are there any certifications out there that can sort of make this easier for us? There are two I would like to highlight here. There is the Responsible Wool Standard, and then there is CQ Merino. The Responsible Wool Standard and CQ Merino are two prominent certification schemes intended to signal improved animal welfare, environmental management, and supply chain transparency in wool production. The Responsible Wool Standard is a global third-party audited standard used by many international brands and requires, among other criteria, that the sheep are unmulesed and that there is some form of land stewardship. set in place. C2 Merino applies specifically to merino wool, sourced mainly from New Zealand, and combines animal welfare, fiber quality specifications, and full farm transparency. Both of these certifications are used by the industry and by brands to secure or to show some form of traceability, transparency, and overall responsible sourcing. But that obviously doesn't mean that there aren't criticisms as well. While mulesing in both these certifications is not allowed, tail docking still is, and anesthesia during these procedures is not required necessarily. I've also seen criticism of the CQ Merino certification because it comes from the industry, which very much means that it is an industry auditing and certifying itself, and that comes with its own problems. Its operation comes from within the commercial wool sector, and it does not include any labor certifications, the kind of labor transparency that you see with other certifications like GOTS, for instance. If you want to go full Gita Marie bingo on this, can you imagine what I'm about to say? So if I am to deduct something as a fellow consumer and individual, I have been vegan for almost 10 years and I haven't bought any new wool products in that time either. I still use the wool I already have. I have no problem buying vintage or thrifted things, but I am not supporting new wool simply because it is in many ways so incredibly untransparent. Okay, both untransparent, but it also comes inherently with animal exploitation. If someone has a commercially viable business selling animal products, animal exploitation is part of it. I also generally just do not care for the kind of sustainability lingo that is used by the industry. So even if I did find specific manufacturers that were better, I still think they are in many ways misleading consumers to an unacceptable degree. I think there's a lot of truth to the quality and properties of wool, but you can find those in other materials and fabrics as well. And you can get it secondhand if it's really a deal breaker to you to use other things. Like, are we surprised? Are we surprised? The conclusion is buy less, use what we already have. That now I'm starting to sound like I'm funded by the Australian Wool Innovation Limited. Anyway, but the main reason why I'm making this video and the main reason why I think it's important to talk about this is to get a more nuanced, broader perspective on what these industries entail and what their impact is, rather than just buying what they're selling. So now you perhaps know a little bit more about what it means when we buy something made from wool and how we can be skeptical or critical towards statements and claims like something being biodegradable and natural and sustainable, etc. I hope this video was helpful in that regard. Thank you so much for watching and have an amazing day. If you want to see more impact analysis videos, I have a whole impact analysis playlist on my channel. Go and find that. And if you have ideas for future videos, feel free to comment down below. Let me know what you thought of this video and what you want to see in the future. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing day and I will see you guys next time. Take really good care of yourselves. Until then, bye.